Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Bivši ambasador Pakistana u Velikoj Britaniji, profesor na Američkom univerzitetu u Washingtonu, autor više nagrađivanih knjiga i dokumentarnih filmova iz oblasti islamskih nauka, borac za međureligijski dijalog i jedan od najutjecajnijih muslimanskih intelektualaca u Americi. Ambasador Akbar Ahmed za Al Jazeeru govori o Gazi, krizi muslimanskog svijeta i budućnosti islama.
So Ambassador Akbar Ahmed, hello and welcome to Al Jazeera. Now let me start by asking you, Syria is war-ravaged. Iraq is on the verge of collapse. Libya is being effectively run by competing militant groups, and Gaza is being bombed mercilessly by Israel. Has the Middle East witnessed worse times in history?
First of all, let me say how delighted I am to be on Al Jazeera Balkans. This is my first experience. I've done a lot of work on Al Jazeera, but the first time for the Balkans, and it's a very interesting part of the world, so I'm very pleased to be on the show. Yes, not only the Middle East, don't forget Afghanistan, parts of Pakistan. You are seeing many parts of the Muslim world, including North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, going through a stage of turmoil and turbulence. These societies, many of them traditional societies, many of them tribal societies, are undergoing vast transformations and changes, and that is affecting the lives of millions of people and affecting international politics.
But wouldn't you agree that the Muslim world has not shown enough interest or support for the plight of Palestinians in Gaza? Are Muslims becoming immune to the plight of Gazans?
That's a very good question. I've often thought of that myself over the last few days. On the one hand, you see the suffering. On the other hand, you see the lack of response. I know that people in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other Middle East countries immediately respond if there's some mosque attacked or the Holy Quran is desecrated or the Holy Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him, is attacked. And yet we see a strange numbness almost. I think what's going on is this widespread suffering in the Muslim world right now. So people are, as it were, numb to the pain of others. I don't think people have lost compassion. You're seeing not only Muslims, so many non-Muslims affected by this violence, especially the images of the children being killed in school. It definitely affects people. But when you have societies already suffering in their own locations, in their own suburbs and neighborhoods, it's very often difficult to think beyond the neighborhood, and that is what is going on. Take Afghanistan, for example. That country has suffered for 3 decades, non-stop war. The Soviets, then the Taliban, then the 9/11 episode, and then the NATO and the United States, and that's still going on. They haven't found peace yet. So it's very difficult. That is the challenge of humanity, not to lose sight of our common humanity, not to see suffering in terms of Muslims and non-Muslims, but to see suffering in terms of mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters who lose members of the family.
Right. Looking at the Middle East from a broader perspective, Iran has increased its influence in neighboring Iraq, in Lebanon, in Syria, and even in Afghanistan. Do you see the revival of so-called Shiite crescent?
These are all cliches constantly being used. Don't forget that the Iranians have had a very ancient history, a very proud history, and they've been a very influential player in the region. The Safavids, before them, so many Iranian dynasties, Persian dynasties, and today too, Iran wields a great deal of influence. In Pakistan, from where I come, something like 30% of the population is Shia, which means that out of a population of 200 million people, there's a very large number. So even countries like Pakistan, which are Sunni countries, you have huge Shia minorities. And that means that Iran has influence beyond its borders in all these countries. Now, when there is this crisis taking place in societies, every nation will promote its own interests. Every nation will want to assert its own foreign policy. And the tragedy very often is that this foreign policy clashes, and the people who suffer the most are ordinary people. Whether they're Shia, whether they're Sunni, it's the ordinary man and the ordinary woman who then suffers.
But do you see all these conflicts having a sectarian note? Do you see a major Sunni-Shiite conflict in the making?
It is becoming Shia-Sunni. Again, I give you the example of Pakistan.
But you say it originally wasn't. It was more geopolitical.
It was always there. Remember, Shia Sunni is a division, it's a split within Islam which goes back to early Islam, but people lived together. It was there and it wasn't there. People married between Shia Sunnis, the people worked together, people played together. I know that in South Asia this was the case. Sometimes you had friction, sometimes you had limited violence during festivals or processions, but not sustained in the way we are seeing it now. What you're seeing now is a very dangerous interpretation of this particular split, and it is being fueled by the ambitions of nations. When that begins to happen, then it is no longer a religious confrontation, it becomes something more sinister, more dangerous, and more deadly for ordinary people.
Now, for many years, the West has been very critical of Muslim countries not being very democratic, yet these same countries kept silent when the Egyptian military toppled the first democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi, or when the Saudi and Bahraini armies crushed pro-democracy movements in Bahrain. How do you explain that?
Well, I explain it like this. We shouldn't be so bothered about what the West is thinking of the Muslim world. I think the Muslim world has to really solve its own problems. We, as the Muslim world, we have to think in terms of how does democracy, how can it be compatible with our own values, our own traditions, and work a way in which we can live in the 21st century without having to either revert to a form of existence which is going to make it very difficult for the next generation, or then completely give up our traditions. It's this balance between modernity and tradition that is the challenge for, I think, Muslims. We should not be so obsessed with what the West is thinking or saying at a particular time, because the West, again, or not the West, there's no such thing as the West, they're individual countries, they will promote their own interests. They're not going to promote your interests or my interests. They're going to promote their own interests, which means they will at times ally with one dictator and justify that. At times they will drop that dictator, as they've done. Recently you're seeing President Musharraf, President Mubarak, these were all dictators in uniform. They were elevated and they were dropped when it didn't suit Western powers. So again, see it in terms of movements within nations to promote their own interests, not so much in terms of the Muslim world and the not-Muslim world.
But do you see Muslim intellectuals working on creating a symbiosis of Islam and compatible democracy?
Well, Harun, now you have raised a very sensitive point, and one that I feel very agitated about, which is the lack of thinking, scholarship, intellectual creativity in the Muslim world. We have some extraordinary Muslims. I congratulate you here in the Balkans. I've met some excellent, very impressive scholars in Bosnia. You have a great track record for scholarship, but that is not sufficient. A critical mass that must then propel society has not formed. So Muslims are spending a lot of their energy in politics and building huge buildings, huge mosques, building monuments to themselves, empires, but they're not investing enough in libraries, in books. And without that, no civilization can really flourish. And that is the challenge of Islam. You know that in Islam, ilm, or the word for knowledge in Arabic, is the second most used word in the Quran, the second most used word. The Holy Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him, had said, the ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr. Now these are admonishments to Muslims to constantly seek knowledge. And yet you look at the condition of the Muslim world. So no, I don't think Muslims have done enough. If they had done enough, Muslims would not be in this plight where you see Muslims killing Muslims. One day they're killing them because they belong to the wrong ethnicity or the wrong sect or the wrong tribe or the wrong ideology. This is not a good example to give to the rest of the world. If I wasn't a Muslim and I was looking at Islam and I'd say 1.5 billion people and most of them seem to be busy killing each other, what is going wrong? You can't continue to blame others. We have to strengthen societies from within. And the first step and the most important step, according to the Quran, according to the Holy Prophet of Islam, is to follow the path of ilm. Because from ilm, you have compassion, you have ihsan, you have balance, you have adl, which is justice, and you have a society that is in harmony.
Right. Quite a number of analysts have pointed to Turkey as being a potential role model for the Muslim world. What's your take on that?
Again, Turkey is a very important part of the Muslim world, a great leader in the Muslim world, as was Pakistan at one stage, you have Malaysia, another example, Indonesia. So there are countries struggling with this very notion of trying to balance modernity and tradition. You have many examples. At the same time, you have many societies, which we've discussed, undergoing this period of turmoil and conflict, which means that for the next couple of decades, it is the young generation among the Muslims who will determine the direction of Islam. If there are enough young Muslims committed to scholarship, to peace, to harmony, to discovering the strength within Islam, which is this balance, I think things will be fine. If that doesn't happen, we will have more conflict, more bloodshed, because the world cannot ignore Islam. The world cannot say Islam should disappear. You have 1.5 billion Muslims, you have 60 nations which are Muslim, and they are not going to disappear. Therefore, the world and the world of Islam must come to some agreement where they can live together in peace and in harmony.
Is it possible to have a pious society living in a secular state?
It is, because what is piety? Piety is to be good, to be decent, to respect your neighbor, to respect rules, to respect regulations. You can be that without having to have faith. There are many people who I know, I met who live in the West, and they say, for example, America or the UK or Western societies, they will say there's so many virtues here which are very Islamic. These are not Muslims, and yet they have the virtues that Muslims respect. Respect for family life, respect for knowledge, for libraries, for neighbors, respect for science, for ilm. All these are in societies that are not necessarily Muslims, and Muslims may have lost some of these values.
Now, well, you have traveled the Muslim world quite a bit. Some people have talked about a potential Islamic revival. Do you see one as happening right now?
It's a very interesting question, Harun, because I'm seeing a certain contradiction taking place. On the one hand, we are talking about the challenges to Muslims. On the other hand, I find that so many people are converting to Islam. And I find this a really interesting...
but also Muslims returning back
and
to
Muslims
religion.
and Muslims returning, especially the young generation, the third generation of migrants to the West. They are rejecting the secularism of their fathers and reverting to Islam. And I'm interested because I say, what is going on here? And they say, especially the converts, they say that we are attracted to the purity of Islam, particularly the notion of Tawheed, the unity of Islam. And they say that gives us clarity in understanding the divine, in approaching the divine. So it's fascinating how Islam still has this power and this attractiveness to be able to be a 21st century religion, which then brings me to your earlier comment that in an age of secularism, you have one faith which is standing up and saying, here is a coherent way of living in the world and looking at the world. And that becomes a challenge for every Muslim.
Now, while traveling through Europe, quite a number of Islamic activists have called for certain segments of Islamic law to be applied for Muslims living in the EU. Do you see that as being possible in the near future?
I don't see it as possible in the near future. I've traveled to many parts of Europe. I'm traveling with a team of young scholars. The project is called Journey into Europe. We are looking at Islam, immigration, and empire, the relationship between Muslim migrants and these European empires over the last few centuries. And I'm finding some fascinating things as we travel. First of all, people are very, very kind, very receptive. We've been welcomed wherever we've been. Very many people are committed strongly to interfaith harmony, to living together, Muslims, non-Muslims, Jews, Christians, societies that are mixed. And at the same time, there are many challenges we are finding that Muslims and non-Muslims will be facing challenges which again cannot be ignored. So you have huge populations. Take Germany. Now you have about 4 million, maybe more Muslims, mainly Turks, living in Germany. So what do you do with them? Well, the German government, German senior figures are now making strong efforts to reach out to the community and seeing how within a secular constitution do you adjust to a religious minority. Muslims themselves are now beginning to adjust. We are coming from Cologne. Now Cologne has this new mosque. It's a beautiful mosque. It's a very modern piece of architecture, and Muslims are very proud of it. But the architecture is interesting. It is so modern that you can miss it. You can say, is this really a traditional mosque? It doesn't have the usual, it has a minaret, but it looks like almost like a space age dome and a space age minaret. So again, Muslims are making efforts to adjust to living in Europe. which does not mean that the problems of racism, of ignorance, of prejudice, of hatred are going to disappear, because migrants anywhere, not necessarily Muslims, migrants anywhere face these challenges. And governments have to be more compassionate, governments have to be more understanding, and I think governments have to be wiser. Now, the conclusion of this study, Journey into Europe, will be to show our findings and share our findings about Muslims as a minority living in Europe today. So it will be a holistic picture, a picture of the Muslim community as a whole living in Europe today, the challenges, the opportunities, and the ways ahead to build bridges between the communities.
Right. Now let's move on to the United States, where you have been living and working for some time now. A recent Al Jazeera documentary showed that American Muslims were being wiretapped by the FBI, and quite often the victims of FBI's so-called sting operations. Are American Muslims the greatest victims of the September 11th attacks?
I think the situation of the American Muslims I found fascinating, because I was there before 9/11, during 9/11, and after 9/11. Now, I would say that before 9/11, the United States was probably the best place possibly in the world to be a Muslim. No one bothered you, people had respect for you, Muslims were doing very well, they were middle class, doctors, entrepreneurs, and so on. After 9/11, Americans had a lot of questions about Muslims. Why did they attack us? What happened on 9/11? What is this religion that these people belong to? Now, here was again a great opportunity to explain Islam, to build bridges, but also a great challenge, because a lot of people had no idea what Islam was, and therefore they had a lot of suspicions, a lot of prejudice. Sometimes they had very weird ideas about Islam. I was very often asked, do Muslims believe in a moon god, or do they believe in an idol? So really people had no idea. And again, it's been only a decade, and I hope, and I've been very involved in interfaith work in the United States. We are very actively working with the bishops and the rabbis to promote understanding. I hope that our efforts will succeed, and the suspicions and the misunderstandings, and I agree with you that many of these reports coming out are disturbing, because they violate the basic human rights, the basic civil liberties that every citizen in the United States is entitled to. I hope that these misunderstandings will in due time disappear.
But looking at American universities, have you noticed a greater interest in the study of Islam? And if so, what impact is this having on the way Islam is perceived in the States?
Again, the paradox. I again asked a lot of converts, American converts to Islam, why did you convert? Day and night people are speaking against Islam, especially against women. A lot of white women converted to Islam. I mentioned all this after a study of American Muslims called Journey into America. I spent a year traveling again with my team, and at the end of it wrote up this book, Journey into America, and made a film. And in this we showed interviews of white American women converting. So one of the answers was exactly this, that after 9/11 there was so much negative prejudice against Islam that people got curious. And the Quran, the holy book of the Muslims, became the most popular book in the United States, one of the best sellers. People were coming not necessarily with the idea of enjoying it, they were coming to say what a bad book this was, but that forced them to read. And a lot of people said, they read it and they said, hey, this makes a lot of sense. I'm looking for faith. Americans are very spiritual people. They want some understanding of faith, of the divine, and they are always on the quest for spirituality. And this gave them one alternative. So again, after 9/11, the interest in Islam just shot straight up into the ceiling. And that interest has remained. As you said, American universities are now opening up departments, they have chairs. Students are always very interested in Islam. I teach a course called The World of Islam, and we always have a huge number of students, 60, 70 students every year, which is a large class. They're really interested.
Right. A recent Gallup poll showed that 72% of American Muslims rate President Barack Obama favorably. Now, this is despite his fervent support for Israel and despite the fact that U.S. aid to Israel has increased to $3.1 billion during his term in office. How do you explain Obama's popularity among American Muslims?
American Muslims have a soft spot for President Obama. Don't forget the connections. So whatever he does in terms of foreign policy, his own personality creates links with the Muslim. Not only the Muslims, a lot of other people, liberals, the African Americans, many people have a soft spot for him. But Muslims, I'm trying to explain why. Don't forget, his father comes from Kenya as a Muslim. His stepfather is a Muslim, Indonesian. He grows up in a Muslim environment. I happen to know his sister, and she grew up in Indonesia. Her father was Indonesian, and she's not a Muslim, but she has all the aspects in terms of values, in terms of culture, a great respect and admiration. She told me that one of the most beautiful sounds is the azan, the Muslim call to prayer. So President Obama grew up in that environment. As he was growing up, as people have recounted, he had many friends who were Muslims. I know that he had many Pakistani friends in New York, and I believe that they helped him to appreciate and enjoy Pakistani food. I understand he appreciates Pakistani dal very much. So that allowed him to understand the Muslim world in an extraordinary way. And when he became president, everyone thought that he would use that to his advantage. And if you recall, the speech he gave in Cairo moved the Muslim world. Now, unfortunately, he could not live up to his own vision.
Right, and many were disappointed after that speech.
Exactly. If he had lived up to that vision, I think he could have changed relations between the US and the Muslim world in a very, very positive way, which would have affected millions of people. But that did not happen. And there you have the challenge.
Right. Americans were outraged to learn that the National Security Agency was spying upon them. Yet, a recent survey showed that 42% of Americans justified using the same tactics against Muslim Americans. How deeply entrenched is American distrust of fellow Muslim citizens?
There may be many statistics on this, and I myself, in my research on Muslims in America, especially in the fieldwork, also asked this particular question. I would put it like this. I would say after 9/11, a huge gap opened between Muslims and the majority American population. That gap could have gone much wider if people had not jumped in and created a great deal of interfaith understanding. Do not underestimate the power of ordinary Americans to create interfaith understanding. Rabbis, bishops, professors, liberals, atheists, very involved in trying to create better understanding. At the same time, you have all these incidents, all these scandals, all these events taking place. You just quoted the FBI and the surveillance of Muslims in mosques. That creates the gap. So while some movements are closing the gap, some are opening it. So if the gap was, say, 50–60% after 9/11, it has more or less remained the same. So luckily, it hasn't gone worse. So as you said, you quoted a figure of about 40%. I would say 40 to 50% still have a deep distrust of Islam. They feel it's a violent religion. They feel Muslims don't treat their women properly. They feel that Muslims themselves do not contribute to civilization. These are challenges that we as Muslims face, and we as Muslims must meet them. We cannot simply say these are criticisms, we'll ignore them. We have to face these and prove that we are not doing these, not prove them for your sake, prove them for our own sake. I don't want, I'm a father and a grandfather, I don't want my children to feel that they belong to a religion which treats women badly, which treats neighbors badly, which is a violent religion. I don't want them to feel that, because that is not my religion. So it is in my interest to clarify the record.
Ambassador Akbar Ahmed, thank you so much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you, Arun.